Good morning, everyone. Today in our Quantum Sparks, we're going to talk about the context advantage and how you can become an architect of meaning in your business. This is going to be a game changer for anybody in real estate, which I believe is most of you. Before we get started, I want to remind you that knowledge is only potential power. It is not power until it's executed. So before we dig in today, make sure you have a pen and paper so you can take some notes, because we want to have you execute. Since you're taking this time out of your day to further your business and your life, we want to make sure that you're out executing on some of the things we're going to talk about today. So specifically, we're going to be talking about context today. The context in which a thing is placed determines the meaning that it holds. I'm going to just move this a little bit. Okay. So what is context? Context is the circumstances, conditions, or environment in which something exists or occurs and that influence or give it meaning. So everything in the world has context, and that context is different for each person. But without context, nothing has meaning. Context is what infuses everything with meaning. Nothing exists in isolation. So all meaning is created through the context, what is surrounding the item being spoken of. Context is not optional. It is an invisible hand. It shapes every experience, interaction, and interpretation. So the best in business, the best real estate agents, they are context architects. They shape how buyers, sellers, and the general public experience them. So by using context, you can become one in a million real estate agents instead of just one of a million real estate agents. Without context, everything is confusing. It can be misunderstood. Without context, things seem to have a low perceived value. Without context, there's no trust. And without context, we miss opportunities. Context equals clarity. So with the right context, information goes from just being information to being insight. In context, a service can go from just any old service to a premium. With context, clients feel like they're guided and not just sold. And with context, trust is naturally built. Now, we have to be careful because improper context creates distortion. So when context is missing or misleading, truth becomes unclear, good advice falls flat, and clients can feel skeptical or disconnected. So if you think about this, context is the framework of meaning. In other words, the meaning cannot be expressed until there is context around it. This means that meaning is never fixed. It becomes something. The meaning is born out of the framework. The meaning shifts depending on the container in which it is placed. And as a real estate agent in your business, you shape that container. So context is born from the communicator. Without intentional context, others will create their own, and often it will be inaccurate. Context is a point of view. Every agent has the power to shape how their message is interpreted. So context is not just descriptive, it is directive. It anchors perception. It is the foundation of influence, trust, and client decision making. So why do we need context? Well, when we frame something, it is a shortcut to understanding. So when we, through our communications, create shortcuts, create a framing mechanism, it creates a shortcut so that the person we're communicating with can understand faster what we're trying to articulate. Buyers and sellers don't just want data, they want context to the data because they're seeking meaning. They want to understand, what is what you're saying mean to me? So think of context as the backdrop of everything. So in our business, we have, when we're speaking to consumers, to friends and family, in our capacity as real estate agents, we're speaking with a backdrop of what other agents are saying. So every interaction that a client has with an agent, it is silently compared to their interactions with other agents. So your professionalism, your preparedness, your presentation and communication, everything you do contributes to the perceived value of those, by those who you are communicating to. So that means that everything that you say, your words, your actions, all of it is being compared by those to whom you are communicating, and it is compared to the backdrop upon other real estate professionals. Everything we say in our and do in our industry. So these are just different examples of the contexts within which we work every day. Another one that it's created a context for our industry is the backdrop of the NAR settlements. So because of the NAR settlements over the last 12 months, the trust of real estate agents is on trial. The lawsuits in and of themselves have cast doubt on industry-wide practices. So to maintain credibility, individual agents must clearly differentiate themselves by establishing professionalism, clarity of service, compensation transparency, and ethical conduct. When we are showing real estate, so let's think of another situation in which context plays a role. And by the way, context plays a role every day in every interaction that we have, because we as humans seek meaning. So in every piece of information we receive as humans, we are trying to make sense of that information. And that is true in our business as well. So as communicators, when we're communicating, those to whom we communicate in our business are trying to make sense of that information. Well, context plays a role as well when we sell real estate. So all of us have had that situation in real estate where you take the client to the very perfect home. This client is very clear about exactly what they're looking for in a home. And so you take them to the first house that they look at, has everything that they are seeking in a property. And then what happens? They don't want to make an offer. Why? Because they have no context. They have nothing to compare it to. When showing houses, the one that the buyer chooses is always a byproduct of the others that they have looked at. So context is the backdrop of everything. Of course, the house they put an offer in on has a lot to do with that house, but it equally has to do with the context, which is all the other properties they've looked at as well, which is why it's such a hard decision to put an offer in on the very first house that they look at, even when that house meets every one of the criteria that they were seeking. The backdrop of the market and timing. So, what's really interesting about our business is that, in my opinion, having been a broker for now 25 years, the difference between agents that have massive results and those that struggle with having results in their business is the ones with really good results are masters at articulating context, creating context so that the consumer can understand why that agent is different than other real estate agents. But they're also masters at creating context when it comes to explaining process to the consumer. So, for example, in most of the markets that we do business in, the market is shifting. So, the market today is different than it was 2 years ago. So, as a professional, when you're sitting with a consumer, you can say, as you're explaining pricing, you're at a seller's house and you have your CMA that says this is how much the house is worth. And you know that 2 years ago that house was worth more. But now you have to explain it to the seller. So many real estate agents simply explain it by saying, well, the market's different today than it was 2 years ago, so your property is worth less today than it was 2 years ago. That is not an explanation that creates context. Creating context requires an explanation that 2 years ago, the interest rates were different than they are today, and how that translates. So the buyer of your home today would pay this amount of money with a 5% down payment. 2 years ago, they would pay this amount of money with a 5% down payment. That is creating context for the seller. Or how about showing them what the inventory is today versus what the inventory in the market or in that price point was 2 years ago? That creates true context. And when you create true context, it is easier for the consumer to make a decision because you've infused your dialogue and your presentation with meaning instead of just words. How about the backdrop of pricing? So, for example, in every single market, you have those houses where the property owner prices extremely low with the hopes of getting a very high offer. So, we know as real estate professionals that the best way to get over market value for a property is by pricing under market value. We know that if a homeowner prices under market value, we are much more likely to get a bidding war. So, in a market that is shifting, like we're seeing, where prices are coming down, and a seller says, well, I want this amount for my property. Well, first, you have to go back to the dialogue we just had. You have to give them context and talk about what a payment would be for the buyer of this property 2 years ago with a 3% interest rate versus what their payment would be today. You have to show them what the inventory looked like 2 years ago versus what it looks like today. That's to explain market value. Well, if you want more than market value, then you have to go on to create context for that as well. And you have to show through context that the people that get more than market value for a property are the ones that price below market value from the start. And by the way, you have examples of this in every marketplace. So you have to have those examples in your back pocket as part of your presentation. So when the seller says, okay, I get that this is where my market value is, but I want more than that. Well, the only way that you might get more than that is by pricing below market value. And here's examples I can show you. This seller priced below market value and get over market value. So bring evidence. The evidence creates the context. Context is how you are experienced. So clients don't just evaluate what you say, they interpret the frame that you deliver it through. So you are the creator of the frame when you go beyond just saying words about who you are and what your value proposition is. Business grows when you can master context. Those who can master it become trusted and they become referred. Their business is not accidental. So if you look at super high performers, it is no accident that they're super high performers. They are architects. They create context because context creates meaning, and that meaning helps consumers make decisions. So in every conversation, every appointment, every presentation, every marketing piece, and every interaction, you have to ask yourself, how do I put this in context? How do I help the consumer understand what I'm saying? How can I reframe this so that the consumer understands the importance? So how can you create context? Well, number one, you can create through story and dialogue. So, for example, telling a story. So, a seller says to you, well, I want to get more than market value for my property. So, I want to price it here, which is over market value. So, one way to create context is to tell a story. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, this is what happened to another owner of mine who priced above market value. And even though I told them that if they wanted above market value, they had to price below market value, they priced it above market value. And here's what happened. And they got significantly less. Listing and buyer presentations. How do you create context as compared to what? So, what this means is when you're creating your buyer and seller presentation, be super clear as to when you give a value proposition. For example, we hear a lot of real estate agents say I'm a multi-million-dollar producer. That creates no context because the consumer has nothing to compare that to. And we're going to talk about what that might mean in a minute. You can create context as well through your appointment flow and structure. So we said a few minutes ago, how many of you have experienced that time when you sit with a customer, they tell you exactly what they're looking for in a home, and you go find that home. You find the perfect home for them, and it's the first house you show them, and they can't make an offer because they have no context. Because people make offers on property based on context, not only the house they're looking at, but all the houses that they looked at already that didn't fit. So you can create context by the ordering of the houses that you show. If you know this is the perfect house, set up your 4 showings and put that one last. Visual appearance and branding. So you create context with everything you do, from your appearance, same with like listing photos, staging, all of that is creating context. Online presence and communication, your professional profiles, you have all of this is you creating context for your business. And of course, timing and market dynamics. That's why when explaining to a seller that the prices today are lower than they were 2 years ago, that does not create context until you actually show the market dynamics and say 2 years ago at this time, this is how many houses were on the market. There was no inventory to choose from. So the law of supply and demand meant that it was easier to get an offer back then. But here's how many properties we have on the market today. So you can show them how timing has influenced the market. You're creating context. Now, merely mentioning a value proposition. So this is the difference sometimes between super high performers and those who don't get the results that they wish they could in our business. They have the ones that don't get the results sometimes, they have a presentation, hopefully, where they list out what their value proposition is. Now, first, merely mentioning a value proposition subliminally suggests that it has meaning. So the problem is, if you don't create the context, then the meaning is assumed. And the problem with that is that you risk someone else, for example, a competitor coming in after you, coming along and creating the context for you. Value proposition seems important to the consumer in isolation, but it loses significance or even backfires without context. So saying to yourself, I'm a multi-million dollar producer sounds great. And however, let's say somebody else comes in and does a presentation and is super clear about what it means. And that next person who comes in, that next real estate agent says, well, a lot of real estate agents say they're a multi-million dollar producer. Really, that doesn't mean anything. Is it multi-million over 20 years? Is it multi-million, like 2 million or 30 million? So just the mere mention of a value proposition, there's no context. And so it can easily backfire when you're up against other real estate agents. So the consumer will, for the time being, maybe think that there's value in the words you've given until somebody comes along and clarifies for them. So value proposition in and of itself has no value. $1 million producer really doesn't mean anything. Is that one house? You could sell one house and call yourself $1 million producer. 20 years in the business in and of itself doesn't mean anything. Did you grow in 20 years? Did you sell one house in 20 years? Did you get your license and never really did anything with it in 20 years? Over 30 homes sold even. That's a little more clear, but it still has no context. Is that 30 homes in 30 years? Award-winning agent. And I see this a lot. Real estate agents will talk about what their award is without offering any context as to what it means. Or top market share. These in and of themselves really have no value because they don't have meaning until the context is introduced. So there's a difference between presenting information. That's what a value proposition is. Presenting information. This is the act of delivering facts, data, or details without directing how the recipient should interpret or feel about them. So these pieces of information, 20 years in the business, award-winning agent, top market share, those are neutral, flat. They rely on the audience to extract meaning on their own. Framing perception is where you want to be as a professional agent. This is the act of deliberately shaping how someone should interpret the information received. It sets the emotional, psychological, or strategic lens through which information is received. Don't just present information because the information means nothing without the context. Context is where the meaning is made, the framing of the perception. Presenting information is about what is said. Framing perception is about how it's understood. And the most influential agents don't just give information, they create the frame. They guide the client's interpretation with intention. And in doing so, they build trust, they make decisions easier, and they elevate their own perceived value. So, how do you do this in a real estate business? Well, first, when thinking about the information that you want to transmit to the person you're speaking to, start with the frame. Begin by shaping the context first, not the facts. Define the outcome. Know what decision, feeling, or clarity you want the client to walk away with. 3, use contrast to show value. Don't just describe what you offer. Show what happens without that. 4, layer the story and data. Blend narrative with data to make your points human and undeniable. 5, anchor meaning with repetition. So you reinforce the takeaways that you want the person to walk away with at multiple points to shape their belief. And then at the close, you want to reframe, help the client see themselves in the solution. And that solution is you. So you create the backdrop. And by the way, you are also the backdrop in and of itself. So you create perception about who you are and how you do business, but you simultaneously create context for other agents who are presenting to the same client. So this is why it's so important. We know in most instances, a consumer is meeting with more than one real estate agent. So that is why when your presentation and communication is laced with a massive amount of context, you are reshaping the consumer's beliefs about you and all the other people in our industry who they've met with, so that clearly they see that you're the better choice because of the context that you have created. Warning: context is a frame that turns neutral information into narrative. And narratives, when not carefully examined, become the breeding ground for misunderstanding or misdirection. So this is just important in life in general, is that it could be said that information, just when you're watching and the world communicates to us and we're communicating to the world. So when receiving communication, it's important to remember that all communication we receive is laced with context, and sometimes through context, truth goes to untruth. So it's important to always evaluate the frame when information is being transmitted. So when you're receiving information, it's important to understand what the frame is. Who benefits from the meaning that they're trying to communicate? What context has been removed? And is this part of a larger truth, or is it being isolated? So we've always heard that, oh no, the reporter took this out of context. They've isolated a little piece, a soundbite. They've removed context. How would this look in a different frame? Always ask yourself, what if I reversed the order of the facts? Would that change the way I looked at it? What if I compared this to an unrelated situation? Think of it as curation. So curation is the act or process of selecting, organizing, and looking after items in a collection or an exhibition. So when we think of curation, often we think of like a museum curator is picking and choosing the best art pieces for the museum. But curation is everywhere. So curation takes place in museums. Curation takes place in your real estate listings, from the photos to the staging to the property description. As a real estate agent, curation is happening on your website. Curation happens at every store we go to. The news is curation. So the information that's coming to you from the news, that is curated. Somebody has selectively giving you information because they want you to extract a particular meaning. Political campaigns are the curation of information. And social media is curation. And by the way, our minds are curation. So the stories we tell ourselves are all shaped by context. The mindset someone holds is a product of the narrative, which is the context that they have created internally. So many of you have heard this before, that some people have a fixed mindset and some have a growth mindset. The fixed mindset person says, when I fail, then they look at themselves as a failure. Whereas a growth mindset person realizes the context. They say, well, I failed at this, but that failure has created progress for me. I don't look at myself as a failure under a growth mindset. That the context of failure is a stepping stone under a growth mindset. Whereas the mindset of failing, a fixed mindset, says, I am a failure because I failed. So it's like the destination. So mindset isn't just about ability, it is about identity. And identity is shaped through the contextual cues we absorb. So when we receive praise, failure, language, and comparisons. So internal framing shapes external actions. The mindset a person holds is the internal context that filters every challenge, goal, or setback. So it has been said that if you change your story, you change your life. Well, mindset is the story we tell ourselves about what's possible. And every story has a setting, a tone, a perspective, a context. So in order to change your story so that you could change your life, you have to shift the context, and then the story changes. By the way, before we end, I want to just point out a little bit on money, because context deeply influences how a person perceives, values, spends, saves, and relates to money. It creates the lens through which financial decisions are made, not just based on numbers, but on meaning, emotion, and identity. So there's a cultural and social context to money. So every culture has varying beliefs about wealth, savings, debt, and generosity. And those norms shape what feels normal or feels shameful financially. Everyone has a personal narrative context. So many people operate from inherited beliefs like money is hard to come by or I'm bad with money. These stories form the emotional backdrop of every financial choice they make. Environmental context, scarcity versus abundance. Being raised in an environment of scarcity, whether it's real or perceived, can lead to fear-based financial decisions even when abundance is later available. And then framing and mental models, how options are presented. So for example, paying $2,400 a year sounds different than paying $200 per month. So context changes perception, even when the numbers are identical. And then emotional context. Emotions drive spending. So stress can trigger impulse purchases. So money decisions are rarely about money. They're about meaning. And how is meaning created? Through context. So last quote, everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. So, as always, thank you for joining us for today's Quantum Sparks. You can get previous versions of this program at lairrealty.com/quantum sparks. And as always, if you have anything you would like us to cover in future Quantum Sparks, you can send them over to us at lairrealty.com/ask anything. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.